I can't.
No, they don't.
Here we go.
No.
No, like cream. Cream's okay.
Right, squirt.
But it's Valentine's Day, so you can squirt whatever you want.
No, you can't. No, you can't.
Cream, berries.
No.
Anything goes.
No,
Why
no.
not?
It wasn't me, it was her.
Why do I say these things?
It wasn't me, it was her.
Okay.
There is a certain kind of television moment that nobody plans for and nobody can fully predict. It is the kind of moment that starts somewhere completely ordinary and then, through a series of small steps that each seem perfectly reasonable on their own, ends up somewhere that leaves everyone in the room staring at each other with a mixture of laughter, disbelief, and the quiet understanding that something genuinely memorable just happened. These are the conversations that get clipped and shared and rewatched for years because they capture the raw, unscripted energy of real people genuinely reacting to each other in real time. When the script goes out the window and the real conversation takes over, that is when late-night television becomes something truly special. If you love watching moments like this, where live television takes a turn nobody saw coming and leaves everyone completely unable to keep it together, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. We find the best, unscripted, unplanned, and utterly unbelievable moments from talk shows and put them all in one place for you. There is so much more coming, and you will not want to miss any of it. Now let us get into what happened here. It all begins with cream. Just cream. That is where this particular conversation decides to start, which, in hindsight, is a fairly accurate signal of where the next 10 minutes are going to go. Someone says the word cream. Someone else immediately responds as though this is already a problem. The word squirt enters the conversation. Then Valentine's Day gets brought in as a justification, the reasoning being that on Valentine's Day, anything goes. Someone else pushes back on this reasoning quite firmly. The words creamberries appear. Someone insists this is not acceptable. Someone else insists that it absolutely is, and the whole room is already laughing before anyone has said a single thing that could, strictly speaking, be considered inappropriate. That is the genius of this kind of comedy. The words themselves are innocent. It is the way they land next to each other, in that particular order, with those particular expressions on the faces of the people saying them, that turns everything sideways. The host tries to distance themselves from the direction things are heading almost immediately, pointing at the guest and insisting that whatever just happened was entirely her fault. The guest accepts no responsibility whatsoever. The audience loves this. Nobody is upset. Nobody is embarrassed. The whole thing has the warm, chaotic energy of two people who are very comfortable with each other, deciding to have as much fun as possible in front of a live audience, and the audience picking up on that energy and going along for the ride. Then things shift briefly into slightly calmer territory, or at least what passes for calmer territory in this particular conversation. There is a discussion about shoes, specifically about the color on the inside of a heel and whether that particular detail counts as classy. The host declares it sexy, observes that the guest seems to be getting sexier over time, which they frame as a genuine and sincere compliment. They mention that the guest used to have a different physical style, something described as willowy, and that the current look is working rather well. The guest accepts this compliment graciously. The host then comments approvingly on a specific physical arrangement that the guest appears to be achieving with certain parts of their body. The audience laughs. The conversation moves on, but the tone has been firmly established now. Everyone in the room knows what kind of chat this is going to be. The dress comment arrives shortly afterward, and it lands like a small explosion. The guest tells the host that they're going to split right out of the dress for them, which the host receives with visible enthusiasm, and the observation that the fit does appear to be quite snug. This exchange leads almost immediately into a discussion about spanking, which the guest brings up in a tone of complete casual confidence, as though this is a perfectly normal thing to mention in the middle of a compliment exchange on a television program. The host, rather than redirecting, simply confirms that yes, this has happened, and the audience rewards this honesty with generous laughter. A brief moment of apparent reflection follows, in which the host seems to reconsider whether things have gone too far, before deciding that actually things have not gone far enough, and encouraging the guest to continue. The conversation about body hair deserves its own extended examination because it represents one of the finest examples in this entire clip of how a completely factual observation can carry an enormous amount of suggestive weight simply through context and delivery. The host notices, apparently for the first time during this appearance, that the guest appears to be entirely free of body hair. This is observed out loud. The guest is compared to a dolphin. The host expresses a kind of delighted fascination with this discovery, saying they are absolutely certain about what they are seeing. The guest confirms that yes, this is the case, and notes that the host is apparently the first person to ever comment on it, which seems statistically unlikely given the number of people who have presumably met this guest over the years, but which works perfectly as a comedic beat. What makes this section particularly enjoyable is the genuine quality of the host's curiosity. They are not playing it up for the camera. They are not reaching for a punchline. They seem genuinely interested in this piece of information and genuinely pleased to have discovered it. That authentic curiosity is what makes the audience laugh as hard as they do, because there is something irresistibly funny about watching someone be sincerely fascinated by something that probably should not be the focus of quite this much attention on national television. The fruit segment, which follows not long after, achieves something genuinely impressive by making a bowl of fruit the most suggestive object in the room. It begins with the guest being offered a selection of fruit and being asked to choose something. The guest immediately begins overthinking this choice, wondering aloud what their selection might reveal about their psychology. Specifically, they raise the question of whether choosing a banana would indicate some form of psychological preoccupation with a particular anatomical feature. The host engages with this question entirely seriously, offering an amateur psychological assessment of what various fruit choices might mean. This leads to the guest being asked directly, on television, whether they experience a specific form of envy that Sigmund Freud spent a great deal of his career writing about. The guest considers this question carefully and provides what they consider to be a nuanced answer. The host responds by suggesting that the level of detail with which the guest identified a particular type of fruit suggests a more intimate familiarity with the subject matter than a simple yes or no answer could capture. The guest is pleased with this assessment. The audience is thrilled. By the time the guest actually decides they want a banana, the entire setup has been so thoroughly constructed that the host does not even need to say anything particularly clever to get a huge laugh. Simply asking whether the guest would like a small banana or a large one in that room after that conversation is enough to bring the house down. The guest requests a large one without hesitation. The host fumbles with the packaging. A remark is made about getting it open. Someone offers to help. The guest observes that this is their third appearance on the show and suggests that this particular visit is shaping up to be the most eventful one yet. None of this requires any explicit content whatsoever. The audience has been primed so thoroughly by everything that came before that the most innocent practical task, opening a piece of fruit, has become the funniest thing in the room. The jewelry conversation provides a brief interlude that still manages to maintain the overall energy of the exchange. The host is wearing something on their wrist that the host finds interesting. It turns out to be a bracelet designed to resemble a handcuff, which the guest describes as a classy version of restraint equipment. The host responds to this information by suggesting that perhaps they should establish a safety word, a remark that the audience receives with enormous enthusiasm, and that the guest takes in stride as though this is a perfectly sensible suggestion between two adults having a chat on television. The donut discussion, which arrives in the middle of all this, is a small masterpiece of innocent words creating an entirely inappropriate mental image. The host shares a personal preference regarding donuts, specifically that they prefer their donuts to be so large and dense that the hole in the middle has effectively closed up entirely. They then ask whether this preference makes them a strange or unsettling person. The guest considers this and lands on the word gross. The host seems genuinely surprised by this assessment and asks the guest to explain how they prefer their own donuts. This exchange, which is entirely about baked goods, manages to be funnier than most conversations that are explicitly trying to be funny, simply because of the complete sincerity with which both parties are discussing pastry preferences in the middle of a conversation that has consistently been about everything except pastry. The harmonica moment is the point at which the conversation achieves a kind of perfect comedy that feels almost choreographed, even though it clearly is not. The host mentions having heard that the guest plays the mouth organ and expresses a desire to hear them blow it later in the show. The studio audience, who have been faithfully tracking every double meaning throughout this entire conversation, erupts. The guest clarifies that they do indeed play the harmonica, using the more conventional name for the instrument, and asks whether the host plays as well. The host says they recently acquired one and would like to learn. They suggest that perhaps the guest could teach them. The guest declines, then reconsiders, then declines again, and somewhere in this back and forth, the audience continues to enjoy themselves immensely. The harmonica itself is completely beside the point at this stage. The conversation is no longer about music. It has not been about music since the word blow entered the sentence, and both parties are completely aware of this, which is exactly why neither of them can get through it without laughing.
Shortly after this, the conversation turns to the guest's health, which represents a brief but welcome change of subject. The host notes that the guest had been unwell the previous week and had to cancel their appearance. They observe that the guest now looks wonderfully healthy and uses the word blooming to describe their current appearance. The guest thanks them for this. The audience laughs. The host is briefly confused about why this particular compliment landed as a laugh until someone explains, or perhaps until the host works it out themselves, that in certain contexts, the word blooming carries a specific implication about a person's physical condition that goes beyond general good health. The host decides to lean into this rather than away from it, and the conversation continues. The knee situation provides another opportunity for the show to find humor in something that is genuinely quite mundane. The guest has an injured leg and has been told by their doctor to keep it elevated, so they have propped it up in a way that is drawing attention throughout the conversation. The host notices a pattern of behavior around the knee, which they describe as knee play, then more specifically as multiple finger knee play. This observation, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone that has characterized the entire conversation, gets a substantial laugh from the audience, who at this point are essentially laughing at everything because they have been in a state of sustained amusement for long enough that their threshold for what triggers laughter has dropped to almost nothing. The skydiving discussion is where things take their final and perhaps most unexpected detour. The guest mentions having a bucket list that includes flying with a famous military aerobatic team and jumping with a celebrated military parachute display unit. The host is asked whether they would like to do the jump together. The host declines, explaining that while they hold a pilot's license and are not afraid of heights, they do take issue with the concept of exiting a perfectly functional aircraft with only a folded piece of fabric to slow the descent. This seems like a completely reasonable position. The guest explains that the experience involves being strapped into a harness, which is where the conversation makes its final pivot. The word strap leads somewhere that a conversation about military parachuting has no business going, and yet here they are, discussing it openly, with the host confirming that they personally have no objection to the concept of a strap-on in principle before catching themselves and asking whether the guest would like to continue this particular line of discussion. The guest says yes immediately and with considerable enthusiasm. This leads to a direct and earnest question about group sexual activity, which the host introduces with an apology for how personal it is before asking anyway. The guest takes a moment to respond. The host invites the entire viewing audience to weigh in on what the answer might be, framing this as a democratic exercise in collective curiosity. The audience, having been thoroughly invested in this conversation for the past several minutes, accepts this invitation without reservation. The philosophical discussion that emerges from all of this, about whether everything eventually comes back to the same subject, about whether that subject is always funny and awkward regardless of context, provides an unexpectedly thoughtful note amid everything else.
The guest insists that it is not always funny and awkward. The host, drawing on what they describe as professional experience, maintains that it very often is. This disagreement is debated briefly and with genuine conviction on both sides before the conversation moves on to other matters. The closing moments, in which the host asks the guest to please stop performing a particular physical gesture and then discovers that a slightly different version of the same gesture is apparently acceptable, and in which the perfectly ordinary observation that the guest's socks and tie appear to coordinate with each other, generates one of the biggest laughs of the entire conversation. The host asks whether the coordination of socks and tie is exciting. The guest confirms that yes, in the current context, it very much is. The audience agrees completely. What makes all of this work, from the very first mention of cream to the very last comment about the socks, is that nobody is trying too hard. The host is not desperately reaching for the edgy moment. The guest is not performing shock value for its own sake. Both of them are simply talking, reacting, following the conversation wherever it goes, and trusting that the audience is along for the ride. That relaxed confidence, that willingness to let things unfold naturally rather than forcing them in any particular direction, is what separates a genuinely funny, unscripted moment from one that just feels awkward and uncomfortable. These two clearly enjoy each other's company enormously, and that enjoyment is completely contagious. You cannot watch this conversation without smiling, and that is the whole point.